Okay, I think we're making a slow start now. So if you could just mute yourselves all, please, that would be important so nobody, so there's not much background noise. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Sol Morrissey. Sol is a last year PhD student, so third year PhD student here at the Norwich Medical School. And as with all PhD students, it's a long journey to go through this. So Sol is going to talk about his research on driving and aging in particular. And it's a pleasure to have you, Sol. If you have any questions for Sol, you can tap them you can use the chat to basically write out your question, or at the end of the talk, there'll be plenty of time to ask any questions. So if you want to come on video, then you can ask your question in person. But I'll hand over now to you, Sol. So if you could start sharing your screen, and the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the introduction there, Michael. So can people see my slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Fantastic. So as Michael introduced, my name is Sol Morrissey. I'm a PhD researcher at the Norwich Medical School. Thank you so much for the hosts of the Dementia Open Forum for inviting me to speak today. And I'd also like to thank the Earl and Stewart Charitable Trust for supporting me in my PhD, and for whom the research that I present today would not be possible. So a big thank you to them as well. And my talk today is titled Turning a Corner: How do cognitive changes in aging impact driving behavior? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So firstly, how is driving impacted in older age? Well, driving is a very prevalent activity in older age. And as we can see from this graphic here on the left, over 5 million people in the UK over 5 million older adults in the UK have a full driving license. And this number has been steadily increasing in line with the rising aging population. So by 2040, it's expected that 1 in 4 older adults will be, or 1 in 4 drivers on the road will be older adults. And as the population, grows in age, we expect that this number will continue to rise. And driving is very important for this population group in particular. It's highly associated with maintaining a sense of independence as an older adult, and continuing to drive in older age is associated with a positive mental and physical well-being as well. So it's also very important for people's health. But despite the benefits of driving in older age, the data here, as we see on the right from the Department for Transport, it shows the number of drivers involved in collisions per miles traveled. We can see this sharp incline in the older adult driving group from around the age of 70. So looking at the graph as a whole, we see a U-shaped curve where the two most at-risk groups are the youngest of drivers, 17 to 24, and then the oldest of drivers. So looking at the number of collisions per miles traveled, older adults have a reduced driving safety. And it is this reduction in driving safety which has led to mandatory driving license policies. So at the age of 70, people have to renew their driving license on a triannual basis. So every 3 years, people have to renew their license from the age of 70. And if someone is diagnosed with dementia, they have to legally report their condition to the driving license authority, which is the DVLA. The DVLA will then look for a report from that individual's doctor. So they'll collect a medical report, and the DVLA will make a final decision whether that person is still safe to drive. And this will be reviewed on an annual basis. And then in regard to how driving is impacted in older age, we know that there are physical and visual changes which have an effect on driving. So these are conditions like macular degeneration, cataract, glaucoma. There's a plethora of medical guidance and driving guidelines regarding when somebody is safe to drive in these conditions, but much less is known about the effects of cognition in aging and early dementia, and how these cognitive effects impact driving behavior. So what do we know about how cognition impacts driving behavior? Well, the scientific literature has implicated a variety of cognitive components to have an impact on driving behavior. And these are things like processing speed, spatial working memory, episodic memory, executive functioning, and visuospatial ability. And it is considered that these cognitive components have an effect on certain driving behaviors, such as braking times, lane maintenance, so maintaining a good and stable position in the middle of one's lane, and speed regulation. And then what happens during the healthy aging process is that we see that there are changes to the frontal and medial temporal lobes of the brain, which have an impact on these cognitive components. So we start to see some cognitive decline, which then has an impact on these driving behaviors and makes people slightly less safe drivers. But then within the trajectory towards mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease, we see a greater amount of brain atrophy within the frontal lobes and medial temporal lobes, which in turn has a greater impact on these cognitive components, which in turn reduces driving safety to a larger extent. So we tend to see in dementia that people are more likely to be in road traffic incidents than the healthy aging group. And interestingly, spatial orientation, it has clear relevance to driving, as people, when they're driving, they have to have an accurate picture of where they are in relation to other road users, and as well being able to plan their routes. And spatial orientation also has a clear relevance towards the trajectory between healthy aging to Alzheimer's disease, as it's one of the earliest cognitive functions that can predict whether someone is on the pathway to getting Alzheimer's disease. Despite its clear relevance to driving and aging and Alzheimer's disease, very little research has been conducted into how spatial orientation changes in aging impact driving behavior. So we conducted the decision study, and this was funded by the Department for Transport. And the decision study stands for the driver effect of cognition and spatial orientation and navigation. And this was also supported by the NIHR. And this had three main aims. The first aim was to establish how driving behavior differs across cognitive profiles within healthy older adults. So how do these cognitive changes take place within healthy aging, and how do they impact driving? The second aim was to assess how these cognitive changes interact with driving behavior over time. And the third aim was to develop a normative data set of healthy aging people that we can later compare with early dementia patients. So can we identify the signs in aging that can, can we identify the signs in aging that can identify whether someone is going to be an unsafe driver, not only in healthy aging, but in early dementia? So for this study, this was an online study, and we collected over 1,000 participants for this. All of the participants were over the age of 65. They had an average age of 71. Everybody drove more than once per week within the study and had a valid current driving license. And we collected data from all across the UK for this as well. So for our study protocol, as I mentioned, this was all conducted online. So for the first component of the study, participants filled out some self-report questionnaires. This included their demographics, such as their age and the number of years they spent in education, their health status, which included how many medications they take and whether they have any health conditions, their driving history, which included things like their driving habits, how often they drive, how regularly they drive to certain distances, and how many trips they take per week, and as well whether people have been involved in any road traffic incidents or road collisions. And then their self-rated cognition, which is how do they perceive their own cognition to be, and have they noticed any changes themselves over recent years or across their lifetime. And for the second component of the decision study, we conducted a cognitive battery, which was hosted on an online platform called Neuron, where participants could complete a plethora of online cognitive tests. These included visuomotor response or reaction speed, processing speed, executive functions, which is measured by the trail-making tests, which are commonly used within clinics, episodic memory, spatial working memory, visuospatial processing, and spatial orientation. And the spatial orientation task that we used was the virtual supermarket task, which has been extensively used within our research group within aging and dementia populations. So before I speak about how we use this for our driving studies, we wanted to first conduct some validation of our cognitive battery, because this was a novel or new cognitive battery, and we wanted to see how this related to traditionally used in-person clinical assessments. So we looked at all of our cognitive tests together and created an overall cognition score for our participants. And we wanted to see how this related to one of the gold standard tests for diagnosing mild cognitive impairments and early dementia, and this is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. And we decided to use the Montreal Cognitive Assessment because it takes about 10 minutes to administer, so it's quite quick. It's well regarded and used across the world in many clinics for diagnosing mild cognitive impairment and dementia, and also it has similar domains to the cognitive battery that we were using for testing, such as visuospatial skills, executive functioning, and memory. And when we looked at the association between performance in the Montreal Cognitive Assessment and our novel online cognitive battery, we found that there is a moderate association between both cognitive tests. So people who tended to perform better at the Montreal Cognitive Assessment or the mock-up, they tended to also perform better during the cognitive battery. So for the first study question we wanted to ask as part of the decision project, this was, how do different cognitive functions impact driving behavior? And to do this, we grouped all of our driving variables, things like annual mileage, how many days people drive per week, into three main categories. And these were driving frequency, driving space, and driving difficulty. And broadly speaking, driving frequency relates to how often somebody drives. Driving space is how far somebody drives and how regularly they drive those far distances. And then driving difficulty relates to how difficult people rate certain driving situations and how many situations do they avoid. And these include things like driving at night, driving in the rain, and driving on motorways. That's just some examples. And we wanted to see how these driving behaviors related to all of our cognitive tests. So you wanted to put our cognitive tests against each other and see which cognitive tests have the strongest associations to our driving variables. And we found that within our study, spatial orientation was the key cognitive component that was associated with driving frequency and driving difficulty. So to be clear, having worse spatial orientation ability, this was associated with having less driving frequency, so driving less often, and experiencing more driving difficulty when driving. But because in our last analysis, we had looked at all of our cognitive measures together, we wanted to then look at our cognitive measures individually, so which individual cognitive components have an impact on driving difficulty. And we found for this then that processing speed was also related to driving difficulty. And processing speed essentially means how quickly people can process information within their brains. And this has been previously implicated in many other driving studies as to be a key component for reduced driving performance. And we corroborated that within our study. But we also reported for the first time that having worse spatial orientation skills, particularly allocentric orientation, was associated with having more driving difficulties in older age. We then wanted to look into this in greater detail, and we wanted to ask, well, which specific driving situations are impacted by these cognitive functions in older age? So we looked at all of our driving situations that comprise our driving difficulty measure, things like driving at night, driving in the motorway, and we found that one of the situations was parallel parking. So people with worse processing speed and worse spatial orientation found parallel parking to be a more difficult maneuver. And this makes sense when thinking about parallel parking, because one has to keep in their mind a dynamic picture of how their movement and the car's movement is relating to their local environment. But we also found, very importantly, that turning across oncoming traffic was a situation that people found more difficult if they had worse processing speed and worse spatial orientation ability. And this was particularly of interest because the Department for Transport data shows that not only is turning right across oncoming traffic a greater risk, one of the greatest risk factors for severe road traffic incidents, but we start to see this rise at the age of 50 for older adults who are overrepresented in severe road traffic incidents that involve turning right across oncoming traffic. And from our data, we were able to hypothesize that one of the reasons this might be is through people having worse processing speed and worse spatial orientation ability. So we then wanted to turn our attention to one of the driving license policies. So earlier I spoke about the driving license policy that at the age of 70, people have to do a mandatory renewal of their driving license every 3 years. And this is quite a controversial policy because there's little evidence to suggest that there should be a specific age with which people have to renew their driving license. And yeah, and it's implicated within the UK, but also across the world. There are other driving license policies that are quite similar. And some people believe that it is subtly encouraging older people to reduce their driving, even though they could be very safe drivers. So we split our data down the middle between the under 70 groups and the over 70 groups. And we found that the over 70s demonstrated less driving frequency and space, but no difference in driving difficulty. So people of older age, over the age of 70, were more likely to reduce how often they drove and the distance in which they drove. But we weren't able to go into more detail as to whether this was a natural part of the aging process, because many other studies report that within driving in older age, that people naturally reduce their frequency and space of driving, or whether this is influenced by the driving license policy. We also found that cognitive deficits were associated with avoiding challenging situations, but only in the under 70s. So for the under 70 population who had cognitive deficits, they were more likely to avoid challenging driving situations, but not the over 70s. And one potential reason this might be is maybe having less awareness over one's cognitive deficits in older age. But importantly, we found consistency in our spatial orientation cognitive function. So we found that spatial orientation was the only cognitive function which demonstrated consistent effects on driving difficulty between and across the over age 70 and the over age 70 groups. So this was a robust cognitive marker for driving difficulty in older age. So what are the implications of the study? First of all, we found that spatial orientation is key in older age driving and is one of the clear cognitive markers for driving difficulty in older age. Regarding road safety risks, older adults in general are more at risk of road traffic incidents when turning across oncoming traffic, and these are more likely to be fatal, particularly in older adult groups where there are often more comorbidities or other physical health conditions, and also increased frailty. But we found that the greater difficulty in turning across oncoming traffic was related to spatial orientation function. So this could be one of the reasons why this is taking place in older age, with reduced spatial orientation function, making it harder to turn across oncoming traffic and to gauge the distance between vehicles as you're making the decision to cross the road. We also were able to hypothesize one of the key reasons as to why people with mild cognitive impairment and dementia were more likely to be involved in road traffic incidents compared to the healthy aging population. And this is because people in mild cognitive impairment and dementia, they tend to show worse spatial orientation ability than healthy aging groups. And if we find in healthy aging that where spatial orientation leads to greater road safety risks, this is only going to be exacerbated within the mild cognitive impairment and dementia groups. So one of the key theories we have is that there's a common thread between these groups as to what leads to reduced road safety, and that is worsening spatial orientation function. Lastly, one of the implications we have is that spatial orientation testing could be included within tests that evaluate driving fitness in older age. And we have demonstrated in our study that by using online cognitive assessments that people can complete at home, we're able to get an accurate picture of their spatial orientation ability and establish then how this relates to their driving. So after understanding a little bit more how cognitive functions relate to driving behavior in older age, we then wanted to ask, but how do these relate to the environments in which people live? How do rural and urban environments specifically impact driving mobility and road safety? So what do we know about how driving is impacted by the environment? Well, Professor Chris Whitty, who is the Chief Medical Officer in the UK, in his most recent annual report in November 2023, he highlighted the importance of understanding how the aging population, and in particular, the migration of older people from urban areas to more rural areas, impacts their health and their mobility. So as we can see here from this graph, that by the age of by the time of 2043, there's going to be a much higher proportion of older adults living across the UK, but also we can see that people start to become more situated, more densely situated within peripheral areas and rural areas in the UK. So what do we know about how living in rural environments, how does this affect people's driving? Well, for one, there's less public transportation, so there's a greater necessity to drive, and there's reduced alternatives to driving in these areas. There's a greater distance to amenities, which could be local shops or healthcare providers. So not only do people have a greater reliance on driving, but they also have to drive further distances. And also, we know from data that I will present later on that rural roads have an increased risk of fatalities. And this is often due to characteristics of these environments, such as having higher road speed limits and also unsealed roads and narrow roads, things like bendy roads and things like that, which also have an effect on an increased risk of fatality in rural roads. So looking then at the protocol for our rural-urban study, so we use the same data set as our previous study that I presented, and this involved people completing their self-report questionnaires followed by the online cognitive battery. But we had 969 older adults who had reported their location data, which was their postcode. From their postcode, we used the 2011 environmental classification data from the UK government to glean whether they lived in rural or urban areas, and 30% of our population lived in rural areas. And this was very representative of the UK in general, where there's 2.5 million older adults living in rural areas and 8 million overall. So it's about 30% both within our sample and within the UK. And we wanted to look specifically at how does driver mobility differ across these rural and urban environments, but also road safety. So is there differences in the people who've been involved in road traffic incidents across these rural and urban environments? And we looked specifically for recent road traffic incidents, which are things like road collisions, within the past 3 years before taking part in this study. And we classified that as a recent road traffic incident. But then we wanted to see, how do these changes take place over time? So do we start to see changes in driver mobility 1 year later? And do we see changes in road safety 1 year later across rural and urban participants? So we conducted the same protocol as our baseline protocol, where people completed their self-report questionnaires followed by their online cognitive testing. And we had 574 older adults from our original sample who took part in our follow-up testing. We had a similar amount of people living in rural and urban areas, again about 30%. And again, we tested whether people's driver mobility, that was within their self-reported data. And we also asked people to self-report whether they had been in a road traffic collision within the past year since their initial testing. So firstly, to talk about our driver mobility findings and whether there are any differences across rural and urban areas. We looked at things like annual mileage differences, driving space, so how far people tend to drive, how many weekly trips they take, and what's their typical trip distance. We found that people who live in urban areas, they tend to have a lower annual mileage than people in rural areas, a smaller driving space, so a smaller area in which they typically drive, shorter trip distances, but interestingly, they made more trips per week. And we consider that this might be because if people live in urban areas, or they might be more likely to take smaller trips. So say, for example, if someone is doing a food shop, if they live far away from the shop, they're likely to do a big shop that takes into account their whole week's needs. Whereas if people live close to the shop, they might do more trips per week to get their shopping done. So we then looked at our follow-up data 1 year later, and we found that people living in urban areas, they showed a greater reduction in their driving space. So they reduced the area in which they typically drive compared to people in rural areas. They were also more likely to avoid challenging driving situations than people living in rural areas. And we consider that this might be because people living in rural areas, they just have less route choices for where they want to go than people living in urban areas, where there is more street network connectivity. There's more roads, there's more routes for people to take, so they can avoid specific situations if they don't feel comfortable driving with them. But we then wanted to look at, how does brain function come into this? Is there any cognitive interactions as to why people may reduce their driving space or avoiding challenging driving situations, depending whether they live in urban or rural areas? And we found that decline in spatial orientation predicted reduced driving space over time for people living in urban areas specifically. And we think that one of the reasons this might be is that people are, because they're driving into a reduced area over time, they're not using their cognitive processes for spatial orientation to the same extent as if they were driving a larger area. So they just haven't been practicing these cognitive processes, and this has resulted in a decline in their spatial orientation that has taken place over time. But alternatively, we have another theory that it could be that people, some people who have had decline in their spatial orientation, this is why they've reduced their driving space over time, because they feel less comfortable driving further distances and increasing their driving area. So we're not quite sure which direction it is. We then wanted to look at road traffic safety, and are there any differences in the amount of collisions people have within rural and urban areas? So looking at the Department for Transport data for all road users in 2022, we can see that in rural areas, there's a great proportion of the population who are killed by road traffic accidents. But looking at all casualties for all road traffic accidents put together, we can see that there's a greater proportion that take place in urban roads. And this links back to what I was talking about earlier, where driving in rural roads, they're higher risk because they have higher road speed limits and some road features like bendy, narrow roads. And you're also more likely to be in a road traffic incident within urban areas because there's just a more congested, dense road traffic environment. So we wanted to look at how does this relate to our sample? Do we see more road traffic incidents within rural and urban adults? So we didn't look at fatal road traffic accidents, that's important to say. We just looked at RTIs in general. And we found that people living in urban areas were more likely to be involved in a recent road traffic incident than people living in rural areas. So 14% of our sample living in urban areas were involved in a recent RTI, but only 10% of our sample living in rural areas had a recent RTI. So we then wanted to see, well, how does this relate to cognitive functioning? We wanted to see, with a splitting across both rural and urban areas, does the chance of being involved in a recent road traffic incident reflect on changes that are taking place in the brain? And we found that worse global cognitive functioning in urban residents was associated with their RTI risk. So the people who had a greater decline in their cognitive functioning, they were more likely to be involved in a road traffic accident if they were living in an urban area. So what are the implications for this study? We found that living in urban areas, people are more likely to be involved in road traffic incidents, but these are less likely to be severe. But people living in rural areas, because the roads are less congested, they're less likely to be involved in road traffic incidents. But because of road features such as the higher speed limit, these are more likely to be severe road traffic incidents. So there are different challenges depending on depending on where people live, if it's a rural or urban environment in relation to road safety. And there are also different challenges for where people live in relation to maintaining their mobility in older age. So for people living in urban areas, it's important that they're able to undertake local activities, because from what our data shows, people are more likely to restrict their driving area to more local areas. So it's important for urban planning that older adults who live in urban areas can maintain their mobility and being a part of local activities within their local areas. But within rural areas, because driving is much more important because there's less transportation alternatives and people have to drive further to reach for their mobility needs and accessing amenities, it's very important that we're able to maintain people's mobility after driving cessation. So if people reduce their driving in older age within rural areas or stop driving completely, that they can still be active within their communities. So now we had a better idea of how cognition and driving behavior differs across rural and urban environments. We then wanted to see, well, how can we look at improving driving mobility within older age? And we had a look then at, can GPS technology improve driving mobility in older age? So when considering GPS usage in older age, we know now from our previous work that spatial ability declines in older age, and this has an effect on driving frequency and difficulty. So people who have worse spatial cognition, they're more likely to reduce their driving. But we also know that with GPS technology, that this can provide, it's a useful tool for helping people with navigational difficulties. It provides step-by-step instructions and route finding to allow people to reach their destination without having to necessarily remember where the destination is, because the tool can help guide them. We also know with GPS usage that there's an increasing prevalence of GPS devices. So say, for example, it became popular in the early 2000s to have a sat nav, but also now with the emergence of the smartphone and how prevalent smartphone use is, everybody has their own kind of GPS device within their pockets. And also modern cars have inbuilt GPS devices into their dashboards. So we know that there's a high prevalence of GPS usage within older age. And these are very feasible as well within older age. So previous research that has looked at the qualitative impacts of GPS usage in older age has found that they're very usable devices and they're used commonly. But we don't know in which situations GPS is used by older adults, and we also don't know what impact this has on drive mobility. So that's something I was interested to find out within my research. So when looking at when our GPS device is used, we had a participant sample of 895 participants. This followed the same protocol that we conducted previously, where people self-reported their GPS usage before completing a cognitive battery. We looked at two different questions. When do people use GPS usage and how frequently they use it, but also what situations they use it. So we found that 82.35% of older drivers use GPS. So the vast majority of older adults use GPS. Most use it for some journeys, and the least amount of people use it every time they drive. So most people use GPS to a moderate extent when they're driving. And so the people who tend to have a worse sense of direction, they were found to have a greater usage of GPS. So maybe they had a few navigational, they weren't so confident with their navigation, and they might have had some navigational mishaps, and they then chose to rely more on using GPS devices. And we found that the situations in which people use GPS, people who have a worse sense of direction were more likely to use GPS for the entire journey when driving. And this was particularly significantly worse than people who use GPS devices as a backup and people who don't use GPS devices in total. So we then wanted to ask, how does GPS use affect driving mobility? So we compared firstly whether the people who don't use GPS with the people who do use GPS. And we found that the people who don't use GPS, they have less of an annual mileage, they have a smaller driving space, so they have a smaller area in which they typically drive, they take fewer weekly driving trips, and they have less driving days. So they have a smaller or lower mobility than people who do use GPS. And then we wanted to look at, within the people who do use GPS, how much does the frequency with which people use it have an impact on their driving mobility? So we found that higher GPS frequency was associated with a larger driving space and also a greater annual mileage. So people who use GPS more frequently had a higher drive mobility than people who didn't use it as frequently. But we then wanted to see, well, what about people who are poor navigators? So can this improve, can the use of GPS improve the drive mobility of people who are poor navigators? Because previously, as we found, worse spatial orientation function is associated with reduced driving frequency. But if they use GPS, could that improve their driving frequency? So we split our spatial orientation data into two groups, to good navigators and poor navigators. And then we looked at people who either did use GPS and didn't use GPS. And we found that the people who did use GPS had a higher drive mobility amongst worse navigators. So GPS usage could help offset these navigational concerns in older age. So in regards to the implications for the study, our data shows that older drivers who use GPS are more likely to increase their driving mobility, and GPS devices are commonly used to offset navigation concerns, and this tends to be with people's own self-reported opinion of the navigation ability. So if they're not so confident in navigation, they're more likely to use GPS. Because GPS increases driving mobility, it can also help improve people's independence in older age, as they tend to drive more frequently, and they can then maintain their activities within their local community. Future intervention studies should then be carried out to establish in people who don't use GPS, if they were introduced to GPS, does that then improve their driving mobility? Because our data is just from observational research, we can only look at the people who either don't use GPS or do use GPS within self-reported capacity. But if we have an intervention capacity, we can then see in more detail the impact the GPS usage has on people's driving mobility. And lastly, for the people who don't use GPS, we have to investigate whether they may benefit from having increased GPS instruction and training. And this could be from the manufacturers that make these devices, or healthcare workers who go out and visit people to see if they're not having their mobility needs met. Maybe having training in GPS usage can help them. So looking at our initial aims of the decision study, we wanted to first look at how driving behavior differs across cognitive profiles within a healthy older adult cohort, which we looked at within our first study. And then we wanted to see how these cognitive changes interact with driving behavior over time, which we're able to look at within our environmental study. But one thing that we haven't yet addressed is whether we've been able to develop a normative healthy aging battery that we can then compare with early dementia patients to see if we can identify the warning signs for unsafe driving across aging to early dementia. So for this, we are currently running some driving studies at the University of East Anglia that have branched from our initial decision study. One of them is the sensor study, and this is looking at the differences within a smaller subgroup between healthy aging groups to people with early dementia. And we're looking at the cognitive and biological differences between these groups and how they affect their real-world driving behavior. So we're putting an in-vehicle sensor into people's cars and seeing how their real-world driving behavior relates to the cognitive and biological differences between healthy aging and early dementia groups. And then we're also currently conducting the Indicate study at UEA, and this is in partnership with Driving Mobility, who are responsible for many of the driving assessments within the UK. And for this, we're looking at between people with mild cognitive impairment and early dementia, how our novel cognitive battery assessment is feasible within real-world driving assessment centres. So we're comparing our novel cognitive battery to gold standard driving assessment centres. So the take-home messages for this talk: firstly, most of the older adults are very safe drivers, and driving in older age is associated with positive and mental health and physical health in older adults. So it's very important for older adults to be able to continue driving. Online cognitive tests present a potential tool for future driving evaluations. Spatial orientation is a key cognitive marker for reduced driving mobility and road safety in older age. Environmental setting can have significant impacts on maintaining mobility and aging in place in older age. So people should consider in older age how the environment in which they live impacts the mobility and their ability to carry out activities in their local community. And lastly, in-vehicle technologies can reduce the impact of cognitive impairment on driver mobility. So thank you so much for listening to my talk about my PhD research. And I'd like to also thank again the Earl and Stuart Charitable Trust for their support for me and my ability to take part in this research, and to the University of East Anglia. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. It'd be great to talk. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So that was brilliant. Great overview of your PhD. How to summarize 3 years of work in 40 minutes. That's brilliant. Do you mind stop sharing so we can see if people want to come actually, and then we can always go back to the slides.
Sure.
But we have already the first question from Sapna, and she said in the chat, "Hi Sol, this is great. Thank you for sharing the work. Do you guys also collect data on the participants' life situation, like events that might impact their emotional well-being and impact subsequently cognition?"
Hi, Sapna, that's a great question. And I'm afraid the answer is we haven't actually done much work into this, but that's something that we would be really interested in doing. And some of the research that we're looking at conducting in the future is looking into how people's driving affects their mental well-being from more of a qualitative angle as well. So I agree that'd be a really important and interesting aspect of the research that we haven't really covered so far, but we'd love to cover in the future.
Yes, it's interesting. Didn't you collect, Sol, as well, data on anxiety and depression? Yeah.
So we did collect some data on anxiety and depression, but this was used to validate our online cognitive battery. So this was more to do with the validation work and less to do with driving in particular. But it'd be really interesting to look at our measures for anxiety and depression in relation to how this affects driving, because we know that people with depression, they tend to reduce their driving space and their life space, but we don't know really how it affects their driving in great depth. So that would be a really interesting angle.
Great. And George is just saying, very interesting, comprehensive, and well explained. I agree.
Thank you, George.
And George is also saying it's interesting that people appear to reduce their driving as they age or develop dementia. You want to comment on that?
Yes, yeah, that's very interesting as well, George. And that's something that I spoke about as part of the first study, that we don't really know what's causing this reduction in driving in older age. We don't know if it's kind of a natural part of the aging process or whether it's associated with any of the environmental situations. So say, for example, is it to do with the driving license renewal policy at age 70? And that would be another really interesting arm of the qualitative work that we want to conduct.
Great. And then Shireen is saying, it might be important to keep in mind that your participants generally did not have more severe cognitive impairment. What advice would you offer to families where there is an older adult with clear signs of cognitive impairment dementia, but the person refuses to undergo an assessment to determine their capacity to continue driving?
So thanks so much for that question, Shireen. That's a really challenging situation to be in. I think, well, for one, it speaks to the importance of being able to have driving assessments that can evaluate people's driving in older age. But for the family members, that's a very challenging situation to be in. And I think it's very good to be honest with the person. If you think that their driving is unsafe, that's a very important step. And a lot of research shows that that is one of the key factors that influence whether someone reduces their driving. But if they're refusing to undergo an assessment, that is a very difficult situation to be in, I think. And I don't have the exact answer for that, really, I think.
I think, Shireen, what we usually would advise then is for the family to talk to the GP separately and I guess, talk to them and see what advice the GP would have, even though the GP might not know either, but sometimes they know the family fairly well, but it's a very challenging situation, I agree. So then Jenny is asking, at what age are you considered to be an older adult? Is this a matter of opinion and official age or according to law? That's a great question. So
yeah, that's a brilliant question, Jenny. So we, within our research, we use the age of 65 and over. And this is also aligning with the age in which people are more likely to be diagnosed with dementia. So we use 65 and over as our age to be classified as an older adult. But I agree that there's subjectivity involved there.
yeah, it's an arbitrary. And I think it's these days, of course, people would say in the 60s that they're middle age, not old age. But there is no official or law which determines this, but this has been traditionally the cutoff, but it might have to be revised with the aging population. Nobody knows. Then I don't know, this Friedek is saying, is it quite common? It is quite common in the hospital setting that we, as a dementia team, often have the hard task of counseling against driving as the disease progresses. Often this has huge impact on independence, but it often triggered by reduced capacity and abilities. Yeah, that's, I think, clearly, as a comment, yeah, we can see that in particular, it has huge impact. It's a very emotive subject. You want to comment on that, Sol?
No big comments on that, but yeah, that I think again it speaks to the importance of being able to give the clinical team our evidence from our research. And I think what we found in relation to spatial orientation testing that has clear relevance for the clinical team to be able to help distinguish whether someone might be a safe or unsafe driver, because without that evidence, it's very difficult to make that evaluation.
Yeah. And then Ellie is saying, very interesting, were you able to consider individuals' history of driving skills abilities? Many people may have had poor driving skills safety all their life, despite them driving.
So that's a great question, Ellie. With the nature of our research, we use self-reported data. So we did ask people how do they rate their own driving abilities, but we were unable to have an objective measure of their driving abilities or their driving history going into this assessment. But for the studies that we're currently conducting with the sensor study, we're using in-vehicle sensors that can measure for things like harsh braking. And it's still not as good as a gold standard driving assessment for being able to tell whether someone is a skillful driver, but we'll be able to look in more detail using objective measures into their driving ability in our future research.
Yeah, great point. And Shireen is just saying, thank you. George is saying, how can we educate GPs to understand that dementia per se does not mean people cannot drive safely? And how will you try to get spatial awareness tests introduced, maybe instead of the current arrangements?
So in terms of educating the GPs, to be transparent, I'm not too sure how that process works. I think it's a lot to do with the translation between our research and being able to get our research out with as far an outreach as possible, so it can have some effect on policy. But then for the second part of your question of how do you try to get a spatial awareness test introduced, I think that speaks again to the first point where we're looking to publish our research within scientific journals and then present it to kind of policymakers, and then hopefully they'll be able to take this information and translate it into everyday practice within GPs.
And Sapna is asking us as well, GPs may have to be introduced to navigation wayfinding spatial cognition if they're not familiar with it. So Michael, do you provide CPDs for GPs?
So sorry, Sapna, I'm not actually aware. Michael, maybe you might be able to have more information on this, but CPDs, I'm not sure that acronym is.
Oh, I see. The
professional development, is it?
Professional development, yes.
Sure.
So, well, I think what we're missing so that's what we're working towards with now these sense and indicate studies. The next step is actually then to do a study with the GPs and show what they're currently using and what we're using. Is this, comparable, or is it better? And then create a whole program around GPs. But I agree, that's the ultimate aim, to actually do the GPs, because they sit at the cold face of dealing with those problems before then there is a referral maybe to the memory services or to driving mobility. So this is an ultimate aim. I think we're not yet there, because they will ask directly, well, how does it compare to what we're using at the moment? So we need to, I think, first find the evidence for that. But yes, we'd be delighted then to do CPD. I think in general, as a symptom, to do CPD for GPs on this would be a great idea. Right. Okay, loads of questions. That's great. Any final questions we have before we let Sol off the hook? Well, I can ask you, Sol. So what do you think was the most surprising finding of your PhD then? What did you think?
It's a great question. I think it would be to do with our environment paper and the fact that we found that worse global cognitive functioning was related to road traffic incidents in urban participants, but not rural participants. That's a distinction that I'd really like to find more about. What's happening in urban areas that isn't happening in rural areas in relation to cognitive functioning. Yeah. Because it makes sense that in more congested environments, there's more of a strain on cognition, but we don't know exactly what's happening there. So that would be really interesting to find out more.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, And yeah, and Anita's asking, any thoughts on what you could have done differently?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anita. I think, well, I hope we're answering that actually in our upcoming research, really, because it would be great to compare our results with dementia patients, and then to also look at, well, actually, one of the earlier questions is probably a great answer for that as well, looking at mental well-being in relation to driving. I think that's an aspect that we haven't covered in our research that has clearly a huge effect on how often people drive, and that's definitely something I would have liked to include.
Yeah, there's also a question on pollution or noise. Yeah, would be really interesting. And suggestions on accessing social networks in rural and urban areas. Yes, I agree. Loads of great suggestions there. There you go. You're getting free ideas here.
Yes.
So
I'll have a big acknowledgement section in my next paper, I think.
well, if you want to find out or if you want to stay in touch with our research, don't forget, yeah, I just put in here, this is our email, our website address, and we will also upload, oh, sorry, I think I need to send it to everyone. Here we go. This is our website where we will also upload the talks after they've been edited at the we will upload them. So if you want to rewatch it, and you can also stay in touch with us if you're interested in the research here. This is our email address. So email us, or if you want to get involved or stay in touch with Sol about his research, please do. And just to say, the next Dementia Open Forum is in September, the 27th of, I should get this right, better look it up now. It's the 26th of September at 2 p.m. And so we will circulate information about this, or again, you can find it on our website. And yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you for Sol to talk about your PhD, and hope you all have a good afternoon. Thank you.